around 2021, I sort of said, I really need to do something to honor my mother's roots.
Yeah.
So I kind of explored Les Filles du Roi, and I was there and I was listening to a wonderful podcaster called Sandra Goodwin, and she really inspired me. And I said, okay, let me do one. And then, once I did one, I was like, well, I should do one on this side of the family. And it kind of grew from there. And I sort of stumbled across this goal of doing all of the Filles du Roi, and there are over 700 of them. I'm now on episode 319 or something.
Embark on a journey of discovery into the heart of North American family stories. Welcome to the How We Got Here podcast, where family historian Brian Nash connects with guests to explore the often untold and always fascinating histories of their ancestors. Prepare to be moved, surprised, and deeply connected by these personal accounts. And remember, every family has a story to tell, and every story is worth exploring. On this episode, Brian's guest is Lisa Elvin-Staltari. From Have Roots Will Travel, Brian and Lisa discuss some of the fascinating stories of French North America, from their arrival to how their descendants spread throughout the continent, and where and how you might find them. So sit back and grab your favorite beverage, perhaps a nice white wine. Unless, of course, you're listening to this and driving, then you better stick to coffee.
Good day, I'm Brian Nash from How We Got Here Genealogy, and welcome to my video today. I'm going to be speaking with a fellow genealogy YouTuber, Lisa Elvin-Staltari.
Staltari. It's a rough one.
And you're coming from Arizona, and
I am. I currently live in Tucson.
but you're originally from Drummondville, Quebec.
I am born and bred. And
And what?
I spent most of my life in Quebec until the age of 38, actually, when I met and married my American husband. But worked in the Eastern Townships in Montreal, did a little stint in Toronto, and also went to school in Ottawa. My grandparents were from the Vancouver Island. So I explored that area in my childhood, and my brother currently lives in the Maritimes in Fredericton, and my nephew and great niece, who I have yet to meet, live in Fredericton. So, and I know a little bit about New Brunswick.
Yeah, and Drummondville, I always remember, is the place where you need to go if you're going to
Exactly.
get gas. You stop there, but it's
Yes.
cheaper
Yes.
than
Yes.
before you get in the
Absolutely.
city.
Absolutely. And it's grown up quite a bit. When I went back a couple of years ago, I was like very impressed with my hometown. You know how sometimes you go back
Yeah.
and you're like, ooh, but here I was more like, oh, I grew up. It really
Yeah.
like beautiful. It's actually not what I remembered. It's actually become an extraordinarily pretty place. So a lot of history there as well,
Oh, definitely.
particularly from the War of 1812, which is a
Yes.
little, but definitely built on that time period as well. So grew up with the whole Eastern Townships, English Canadian side of my family. Obviously, my mother was French Canadian, so I kind of took that for granted. Never really explored it. Honestly, never really was more fascinated because I was part of that English minority. I was more concerned about my English and Scottish roots than I was about my French Canadian, which were right there. So I'm fluently bilingual to this day, and can read and write not so much, but actually speak it obviously, and I keep connected to my roots.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, so just tell me a little bit more about yourself. We got sort of introduction. You have a YouTube channel. It's called uh, Have Roots Will Travel, correct?
Our Roots Will Travel was started about, I guess now about 11 years ago. And my concept as I was growing into my astrology, my genealogy, I was actually, um, kind of what realizing how much location had to do with genealogy. And I kind of figured like, and I was a traveler anyway, and I was like, wow, I get to travel to all these different places. So I would be like in Kansas doing something, or I would be doing different genealogy in different areas. And then finally, I kind of said, this is more like, I'm traveling all the time virtually. And now with my RV, I'm actually traveling, physically. And And come to find out that the best travel of all was to travel back to my homeland of Quebec, which, you know, is just incredible to me. And many of my French Canadian friends and family are like, you finally came home, Lisa. And so, you know, and now I guess around 2021, I sort of said, you know, I really need to do something to honor my mother's roots.
Yeah.
So I kind of explored Les Filles du Roi, and I was there and I was listening to a wonderful podcaster called Sandra Goodwin, and she really inspired me. And I said, okay, let me do one. And then, you know, once I did one, I was like, well, I should do one on this side of the family. And it kind of grew from there. And I sort of stumbled across this goal of doing all of the Filles du Roi, and there are over 700 of them. I'm now on episode 319 or something. So I've come a long way. So I've done 300 videos on the Filles du Roi, the King's Daughters. And about 2 years into it, I got requests for something earlier, which is the Marriageable Girls, Les Filles Mariées. And so I began that series, and we're currently on episode 120 of that one. So yeah, no, and I do other videos as well, but that's kind of my not my claim to fame, but definitely something I'm getting known for.
But yeah, the field, it's such, they touch so many people in North
And,
America that have to.
and you know, and people ask me all the time, like when they're doing their own genealogy, I always tell them the difference between a professional genealogist and an amateur, if you want it, or hobbyist, is the fact that we know how to get places faster.
Yeah.
And we know different things, and you have to know how this relates to that and that and that. And so that's part of the challenge of when you're a hobbyist, because you're not doing it all the time. But in my previous life, I was a trainer and a teacher, a salesperson. So I always spent my life really communicating. So this was kind of like a natural thing. And I went full time in it last year. So this has been my first year full timing it, not doing anything, you know, as a regular job, and just doing this. And it's been truly a delight of my life being able to, and I do a lot of speaking engagements now because I have that time. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to see if I can actually do this full time without having a side gig, you know?
Exactly. So let's get into I got you on to talk about your specialty, the French culture in North America. So when
Yes.
people think of, I know myself, when I think of the French in North America, I think of sort of three groups. You have the French Canadian Quebecois group, the Acadians, and then sort of that subgroup of Acadians, the Cajuns. So how do they all connect? Like the big thing I explore is people's roots. I asked a question like, how do we get here? So how did they get to being and sort of be those distinct groups? And
Well, I think a lot of it has, well, we all root in France. I mean, let's start with that. We all have our roots in France. And from there, we explore, you know, we kind of branch out. Obviously, the Quebecois came as of 1617, was the first official pioneer. And then we have the Acadians, who came actually earlier than that, to some extent. And I, again, you are much more the expert on that than I. And so they did not have an interest in going to New France. In other words, they were creating their own country. And the Cajuns, I believe, are the ones who escaped during the Grand Dérangement, and then either went to Quebec. I mean, not Quebec. Well, some of them went to Quebec, but went back to France, and then by way went to Louisiana, and found themselves, and are now identified as Cajuns, if you will, with that background. So that is but there's also a subgroup, which is all of the people in Canada and um, in the US who can trace their lineage right back to either the Acadians and all these three. So it's really important. And every time I do a tree for someone, I am constantly going back to Quebec. It's the rare tree that doesn't, you know, find its way back to Acadia or find its way back to Louisiana in some cases, but obviously Quebec. you know, and then some people in Quebec actually chose to go to Louisiana. I found a couple of documented cases in a case I was working on lately. So it did happen that some went to Quebec and were in New France, and then decided they were going to go down to Louisiana. Because remember, that was all part of France anyway. So it was all part of the New France, if you will, until a certain dates
Like
and that
most
sort of
people
thing.
don't realize Detroit was a French city.
Yes, exactly. So for them, they were just expanding. They weren't going to a different country. They were literally going to a different part of their country.
Now the New France people in the that are down Louisiana now in that area, do they integrate with the Cajuns, or are they very separate? I know that
I think they did. I think they had to because of the common language and religion. So I think that that is, and I found that in this particular tree I was doing for a very, very Louisiana tree. And yes, I found a French Canadian who came down and married into the Cajun. Some married into others, of course, but at that very, very beginning, they were trying to find their own people, you know, and that's kind of very common
yeah.
in French. That is the French stock and trade. You'll find it even when French Canadians go to places like Tucson, or they'll go to places like, you know, Hollywood, Florida. They're going to always, because it's all about family in French Canada. It's all about connecting and making sure you're taking care of your neighbor and the known. And obviously, the language is the key. And so many French Canadians who go to Florida, for example, don't actually really speak English. So they try to connect with my uncles, for example, used to go to Hollywood for 6 months of the year from Drummondville, and they would end up, you know, because they didn't speak English at all or barely,
Yeah.
they would actually connect with their French Canadians, and there was a French Canadian bank that would settle there. So that's kind of an understanding of the French mindset. And it was like that from the word go. They were always trying to create their own unique place. And wherever they went, whether it was Wisconsin and created places like Fond du Lac, I guess they call it Fond du Lac now, and or they go to different places in Colorado or wherever they went, they created their own little world, and that is part of the French Canadian heritage.
And isn't that like, especially early on with immigrants, I think that's just a natural thing. You're going to want to stay with
Of
your
course,
community. But we never we think of Chinatown, or we think of even
yes.
Little Italy when we think of place. It's very rare that people think, oh, there's Little Quebec. But you're right. I know.
Yeah, yeah, no, it really is like that. And I would think wondered about Maritimes when we connected. I wondered if, in fact, in the Maritimes, if you have that kind of French, if at all, kind of coalescing, or has it kind of dispersed over the centuries?
A lot of it, there are still definite French communities. On Prince of Island where I live, I know there, and not so much, but it's probably the generation of people that be my grandparents' age,
Yeah.
even my parents' age, where they might never have really spoken English.
Wow.
They operate completely in French. Their communities are in French, and I, yeah, where they survive. But I think, um, as people, it really started, probably post World War II, when people really started thinking about moving away again. I think
Okay.
for so long our ancestors had come from one place or another that they we almost like got tired of being nomads and moving, where it wasn't as necessarily as big a deal for our ancestors. But yeah, the French communities, a lot of them are very, very, very settled, and
Well, and like even in my own life, my French Canadian mother, Giselle, who is our origins are from the Three Rivers area, yeah, and my father's origins on his mother's side are deep, deep into the Eastern Townships and then into America. But there were generations and centuries that these two families never connected, and
yeah.
my parents were the very first ones to connect. And so it was like they had never had, on my father's side or my mother's side, an English marriage, a Protestant Catholic kind of thing. So it was a big deal back in the 1950s to have that. And so, that's how it's much less now, and it's much more dispersed. And I see the connection, and I see different. My family was unique in that sense of being so homogenous, but there are many who are much better blended than mine were. But it still is true on some level where they don't, especially if you go up north to Chicoutimi. I once went, and they were so kind to me and curious because of my last name, which was at the time Elvin, very English name. And some had never met an English person.
And
So they were like, "Oh, you're from where?" So it was pretty cool.
yeah, I mean, we joke on the island here. There's like a couple French names that are probably the majority of the population have. You have Galants and Arsenault, so it's very common. You have a wedding, an Arsenault wedding or something that you see advertised, but it goes way back. But it's just that those
So
communities are still very, even the ones that not necessarily they might be English speakers all their life, but they're still connected to that.
But we would have that in Quebec when we would have like a red-headed French Canadian, and where did that come from? So we didn't know, and especially when I was going to school, and they didn't know, or they had an English name and
Yeah.
no one knew. No one knew, or they had a French name and they didn't know why. Noel, for example, had a friend name with the last name Noel, and I mean there wasn't really any French name there was that we could find at the time. And so it was really interesting in terms of the merging and the blending. And I mean, we're looking at centuries, certainly with, the New France and the arrival of the Filles du Roi and the Filles mariées. This was a huge thing, and how many people, it became truly a population explosion of itself. You talk about the baby boomers, this was another baby boom.
Yeah,
It's
that
incredible.
the Field de Wa is so interesting because it's it was in a way there's the stories of these girls that were come not all from well-to-do families and come over here, but they had a chance of new life. But it's just the actual forethought in the mind of the French government to think, you know what, we have all these soldiers and all these merchants over there. We want to actually keep claiming this land. We better get some women populate it. Like there was that forethought to they weren't just going to be like having their forts and their trade posts. They wanted to actually set up
They had to
a
get women out there.
society.
That's the bottom line. They had to get the women somehow, and
Oh,
they have proven unsuccessfully. And a lot of people think like, why did they wait so long? Well, that is part of the history of Quebec, that it was not actually run by the French government at the time. So between 1634 and 16, well, actually earlier than that, but let's say 1634 till 1663, it was run by the 100 Associates. And so they had kind of subcontracted
yeah.
the growth of this particular territory. And eventually the 100 Associates went bankrupt. They did not live up to their end of the bargain. They had promised 4,000, colonists by that time. They had, made a lot of promises, given a lot of different land out. It didn't work out. And so they were the ones that during that time we had the marriageable girls, and they were coming one at a time, literally one at a time, and would come, in the 1630s and 40s, just gradually. And I mean, they had huge families, don't get me wrong. The
Yeah.
very first Filles mariées, who, was married in 1634, produced 1,300 descendants by 100 years later. She has an enormous amount of children, of descendants. And but that being said, we probably had 262 of these girls, and that's about 10 a year. You're not going to build a country. You're not going to,
No.
not all of them had children, not all of them survived, all of that. So by 1663, that's when the king took back the New France and said, you know what, this is ridiculous. Let's make it happen. And so his intendant, Jean Talon, is the one that came up with the plan. I call it the master plan.
Yeah.
And so he came up with the master plan and said, well, we got to pay them. Like we're getting all, and this is before the Guerilla soldiers came. So this is, we're talking 1663. And so they said, let's start a program where we actually identify these girls. So we're not hit and missing it. Like these girls actually can produce children. These girls actually will get married and stay here. And then we will recruit them and we will pay them and we will give them things. And that's where the misnomer of them becoming, kind of for hire, and that whole kind of, they weren't women, they were women of ill repute. Absolutely not. And I've only had one that I actually have an issue with, where she got accused of that sort of thing, and that was later with her husband. So it's not even before then. And so by 1663, they said, let's do this. And in the very first year, 1663, 13 ladies came. And that was the beginning of Le Filles du Roi. So all of the marriages, if you have a marriage after a certain date, and this is a confusing part for a lot of people, they think, oh, I must have a Filles du Roi, and they give me the date like 1657. Well, I know then that it's not a Filles du Roi. Or they'll tell me a Filles du Roi, and they'll tell me, oh, but her parents were there. Well, that it cannot be. You cannot have a Filles du Roi, king's daughter, with her parents, not necessarily dead or alive. They can't be in New France. And that was the condition. The condition was these girls had to come alone. Because they weren't going to pay, because if you paid the girls and the parents were there, they're, kind of like a group migration, if you will. So it had to be a single girl. And no interference. And that is why on some lists you're going to find, some Filles du Roi, and then later on they've crossed them out because they found the parents or they found a marriage. In one case, for example, the people were actually married in France and she joined him later, but she was erroneously listed as a Filles du Roi in the initial, big thing. Now, I still, in my biographies that I do, when I come across I'm no longer a Filles du Roi, I still do them because it's like the planet Pluto. Just because we deregulated it or took the label away, she still was a woman. She was still there,
and she went through the experience.
Yes.
Right,
So for me, she's some sort of a king's daughter, and she's definitely somebody's ancestor. So for that, and so that is what began. So we have 1663, 1664. You had maybe 50 or 60 people, and it was coming. But the key is that there was groups of them. So they would come off the ship together, and the men were waiting, and they knew. It wasn't like, oh, did you hear? There's some people. No, they knew well in advance that these ladies were coming, and they were waiting and wanted to check it out, And by 1665, that's the kickoff, because then we have the Guerilla soldiers. Now, they were not free to marry. Okay, they were there to do a job. They would stay until about 3 years. And so at that point, then they were offered the opportunity to stay. And then we have a lot of marriages in that respect. But during the period between 1665 and 1668, regardless of the Guerilla soldiers, there was a lot of marriages going on. Because there was a lot of engagés. And early on in my genealogy experience, I used to think that the engagés were like indentured servants. And I had a very obviously wrong interpretation of it. And I was very much corrected by a wonderful genealogist. And she told me, she said they came and they were contracted. They weren't like the apprentices that would come. They were not apprentices. They were literally people that were hired for a 3 to 5 year term. And so to call them indentured servants is obviously wrong, but they were so I call them engagés. They were the people that would come and would decide to, and many of them stayed. But in order to stay and get married to a Filles du Roi, you had to have land and you had to have something. So these individuals, after their contract, they couldn't get married during their contract. They had to complete their contract, and then they would finally get land or have the money and that sort of thing. And that's when the marriages would take place. So that's kind of setting the scene. And the Filles du Roi carried on until 1673. By then, I mean, we still had about 90 girls coming at one time, and they were traditionally only, I think one year there was 2 boats that came, but traditionally they would only come in the summer, obviously. And the marriages would take place between, very quickly, like I have some on record that they arrived July 30th and were married by August 7th. So
Now,
there are some that literally got off the boat, met the guy, I mean, through the connections. And I have to believe that some of them actually knew the engagés and came across as Filles du Roi because they were able to get their passage. Because when I'm doing one of my videos, and I see they come from the exact same town in France. It doesn't happen very often, but I'm like, well, that's weird. And so the odds are that they either a connection of some kind and it facilitated their reconnection, if you will, in the new world.
so, so were they prearranged marriages before the person arrived?
Not at all. Not, I mean, in that case, they may
It
have
might have
been,
been, yeah.
yeah, it may have been a few of them, but by and large, it was absolutely, they came, I just visited the Maison Saint-Gabriel in Montreal, and it was a wonderful experience. I mean, of course, I'd heard about it, read about it, all of that, but to actually physically go there, and that was just last year, and to go there and walk the walk, it blew my mind. And I recommend anyone go there to be your first stop in your historical journey. But they would come, for example, not many of them came to Montreal, but enough did. And they would stay at a place called Maison Saint-Gabriel, which was run by Sister Marguerite Bourgeois, who was the nun who also founded the Notre Dame congregation and all of that, and worked with Maisonneuve. And basically what the ladies were taught were basic skill sets. Remember, a lot of these girls were coming from Paris. They did not have the skill set for living in the country. So they had to be taught. And obviously the weather in Paris is much, milder than, for example, up in, Quebec City or, all of these upper north. And so they had to be taught that. And then they had to meet the fellows. So in one place, I don't think it was in Montreal, but in Quebec City, it was a large enough place where they had 3 different rooms and you were kind of segregated based on your socioeconomic. And that is one story that I heard about. And so, for example, if you were a captain or you were part of the Canadian Genealogy, you would go in one room with a particular type of lady. If you had this kind of land, you would go in that room, and so on and so forth. But essentially the women were picking the gentlemen based on, do you have land and a house?
Yeah.
And that was it. There was really nothing else. So you really had very solid marriages going in because they weren't expecting a lot of happiness per se. They did get them, but and the proof is there. But and the men were literally looking for women who could survive and thrive. And so they again were not although they, in many books it says, oh, they weren't concerned about the looks and the this and the that. You have to know that the boat would drop off these ladies in Quebec City and then eventually go down. If those ladies weren't picked, they would go down to Quebec City, 3 Rivers, Trois-Rivières, we should call it. And then lastly, Montreal. So it was said, and again, I don't know, that the prettiest girls were the ones in Quebec City. By the time you ended up in Montreal, it was, the slim pickings, so to speak. So again, that's kind of one of those myths that I've yet to truly prove because we don't have any pictures. I don't have any pictures of these cows.
Yeah, and as much as paintings and when you look at paintings, well, I was just looking at something the other day. It was I think it was Queen Victoria. There was some early photos of her and her engagement, and compared to the pictures,
Yeah,
much different.
much different. So
Yeah.
yeah, we don't know. And so perception is, is what it is. It's part of that history of what they viewed as pretty and that sort of thing. But certainly the ladies of Montreal probably had it toughest because it was still a relatively raw frontier land, and they were looked down upon in terms of, Montreal being really not really a very safe place. And it did become safer over time, but as they were landing, it was a place that a lot of them ended up I wouldn't say regretting, but certainly they realized that Montreal, that Quebec City, and even Trois-Rivières, which today is just a small little place, not small, but you know what I mean? It's not that much.
Comparatively, yeah.
Yeah, it's a medium size. And you know, a few of them ended up in that terrible Lachine massacre of 1689. So I have quite a number of Filles du Roi who ended up being murdered at the attack during, we're living in Lachine, which is just, you know, a suburb of Montreal now. And so they had it really rough, you know, those Montrealers. And certainly if you descend from any Filles du Roi coming from, and was in Montreal, these were tough ladies.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, just anybody, even I could think of the prospect of going to a new country where you don't know, especially if you're coming from Paris, where it was a pretty enlightened city for the time compared to.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Can you imagine? Now, the previous ladies, the filles mariées, the marriageable girls, were actually coming much more from Normandy, much more of a relatively, I mean, even though you had the sea and all that, they were much more farm focused ladies. And so the filles mariées were much, I think, hardier in that respect. We just didn't have enough of them to make a colony. But a lot of girls did come from Normandy. And that was a different spot. And there's actually a museum in Normandy, I believe it's, I can't remember the town, but it's just in one of the smaller towns. And it is a museum focusing on all the French Canadians that emigrated to Perche. Perche, that's what it is. And it's an amazing, and you can go on the website and check out, and they've done a lot of information. People like Céline Dion and all of these, you know, Pierre Boucher and all the Trudeaus and all that can trace their lineage back to these early immigrants from Normandy who were very much better prepared than the Parisians.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it does probably sound nicer to come over with a group of ladies. At least then you might have maybe some people you know when you get there because you've had some time to get to know them on the ship, and
Yeah,
they're in
no,
the same
no.
situation. But
And there were some sisters that would come together. There were sisters. I have a group of 3 sisters. I have a group of 2 sisters. And so there were, and you might have had a cousin or that sort of thing. So there is a real connection in some respects. It wasn't always just, and this is the misnomer.
Yeah.
Yes, there were a lot of orphans, but there were a lot of, I would say maybe, I don't know, but I'm guessing 40% were orphans, maybe 50, but it wasn't 90% because in my studies, I always say they weren't typically. And so when we say orphan, like for example, if their father died, the mother may send them, you know, so were they orphans? No, but were they kind of without one parent? Yes. The vast majority lost at least one parent.
Yeah. And I mean, definitely that makes sense as a parent, probably thinking back then.
Yeah.
You can't you can't afford to have it if you don't have that support there. So
And I have one lady who actually has the most, she has 301 descendants as of, from a Filles du Roi standing. And she has the most, and she never gave birth to one child here. But she was a Filles du Roi, and she brought her son with her. She did marry, and she did not have any children, but she brought her son, and her son produced, had 13 or 14 or 15 children. But she is classified as a Fille du Roi. Anne Lemaitre is her name. And so 306 descendants as of 1729. I think it's 1727. So during that time, they actually had some sort of a tabulation to see how many descendants had been produced, and that was that. So you can imagine if in that period of 1727, we have that many descendants, you can imagine how many people can claim Anne Lemaitre as their great grandmother.
I'm just thinking even the government efficiency back then, to know that the governments now lose track of things, but
I know it was, they didn't have a lot of distractions. I think, they could focus. They didn't have, Twitter or, Facebook, and so they could figure it out. But I think that they really wanted to see the success rate of what they did. And, interestingly, a lot of people don't realize that there are census reports. I mean, certainly in Acadia, they did incredible work on that. And I love that about the Acadians. And the Quebecers are the Filles du Roi and the New France did do that. And they had as early as 1666. Then they had another one in 1681. Now, it's so fascinating. There's two, 1666 and 1667, because the first one, they didn't do so good. There was a lot of mistakes. And so the government said, do it again. So you will find many of your peeps in two subsequent censuses, and there's lots of mistakes in both of those, even so. But it's interesting. And in the 1667 census, they actually included things like how much land did they have, that sort of thing. And they got the ages wrong sometimes, but it was really interesting how many goats they would have. Did they have a gun? So there's a lot of interesting, did they have a domestic servant, for example? And that was interesting to see, like, at what level they were dealing, in terms of being successful.
So these girls, they came to Quebec. Now, you talked a little bit about the Acadians. They didn't have the Filles du Roi. What did they do to populate? What was their plan there?
They were extraordinarily successful in terms of, first of all, they came very early, and they had a lot of children. And they literally, I mean, we're talking, the ones that I've seen, and I have Acadian in my tree as well. And so we're looking at extraordinary amounts of people. Now, remember, they weren't trying to populate an entire country. They were just doing their thing. But essentially, there was boatloads and boatloads of Acadians that were coming in those early years. And the family, and that's why it gets so interconnected, trying to figure out who's who. Because, there's a lot of the same names, and you have to just kind of, figure it out. But they did what the New France couldn't do. They focused, and they basically built their own country, and they obviously had a lot of people coming from France. But I think, generally speaking, I'm no expert, but I think, like, most of the people would arrive between 1620s and 1650s in that period. Am I right? Or was
Yeah,
it?
I think it was that's when they started in the.
Yeah, and then they just, populated.
Yeah.
Exactly what the French thought they could do, but they didn't. Remember, it's a small place, Acadia. It's not like New France, where it's, it's much bigger in comparison.
Yeah,
And so I think that's part of it. It was easier to find brides. And
now, did they come as families more?
they came as families more, and also I believe they intermarried with the native population much more, or much more apparent or open about this. And I think that was part of it. Whereas in New France, it was not. I mean, you had that, and I have, absolutely, marriages between a indigenous person and a French, if you will, and they were baptized and all of that. But again, it was not obviously seen as well as, and I don't know, and I haven't had time to really look at the baptismal, if there are baptismals in Acadia. I would think there were, but I know in French Canada, they were very concerned about intermarriage between, I don't know if in Acadia they were as focused as, I'm sure they were concerned about it, but I don't know if they were as concerned in terms of, allowing second and third cousins to marry, which they did in New France as well. But it was, again, I have grandparents who were great grandparents who were second cousins. They were in their marriage record. It actually states that, and they had to get a special dispensation. Again, not having studied the Acadian baptismals or marriage records of that time, I don't know if that was done.
Yeah, I'm not positive on that either. I don't. I think, probably wasn't, but especially I think more maybe after the expulsion, when the number of families were
Yes, and also I don't know if they had, and this is a subject for me to verify. I know that in New France you couldn't emigrate unless you were French Canadian, you were Catholic.
Yeah.
You could
Yeah.
not, yeah, you had to be, so you could be Irish, for example, you could be Irish and come, as long as you were Catholic. Literally wasn't the language.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it's so much back then, and really in Atlantic Canada, up into my grandparents' generation, my mom, even my mom's generation. Um, I mean, I remember in my lifetime, the small community. My grandmother's from Cape Breton, the little town. There's a Catholic hospital. There's a Protestant hospital. Well,
Yeah,
the Catholic and not Catholic hospital, basically,
oh my goodness.
because the
Oh my
Jewish
goodness.
people would go to the Protestant hospital because they wouldn't allow them in the Catholic hospital. Or,
Yes,
you know, and same as the schooling, before the government really got heavily involved in the schooling, you still had the Catholic schools and the non-Catholic schools, the public schools that were.
yeah,
So, I mean, that was very common because even in Prince Edward Island, a lot of the pockets where the Irish wound up moving is you'll see Irish and communities and French communities very close, and it's the religion that brought them there, because
exactly,
they were
exactly,
they were Irish Catholics, and so they have that commonality, definitely.
absolutely.
So I don't know if it's necessarily a rule, but I think it it would be. I don't think there was many people that were Protestants that were part of the Acadia, and
Yeah.
you'd more likely have the non-religious at all, as opposed to.
And that is really the difference between when you look at the growth patterns of the United States during that time and New France. I mean, basically in America, they were allowing everyone to come in. How they were treated afterwards is a whole other thing. But I mean, you didn't have this, you have to be Catholic.
Yeah.
You could be anything. And so that was a vastly different thing. And of course, as soon as the British conquered New France in 1763, then of course all Protestants were allowed, and that's when you saw the Irish and or the Scottish immigration and all that.
But the same thing the British did. They wanted to have a Protestant,
Yes,
so they
yes,
were very much encouraging. At the same time, they had expelled the Acadians, French people. They were bringing people from French areas of Switzerland and France that were Protestants into Nova Scotia, specifically not because of the language. It's
but
because
because of religion.
it was because of religion.
You're right, you're
I,
right.
in Canada, often we think that language is the big social divide, but
Wasn't then.
it was religion for so many years, and
I don't think the religion is that now, do you? I don't think religion.
yes and no. I mean, there's still a little bit of it, but yeah, I mean, you have that, I guess, everywhere. That it's basically tradition, and again, it's because if that's your culture and that's your family and that's the people you know, that's
True,
that's
true. I know when, like I said, when my mother decided to marry a Protestant fellow, that was huge.
well, yeah, my father's Catholic and my mom's Protestant. That was a big
Oh,
thing.
you know it. Oh my gosh, yeah.
The
That's
big thing
exactly.
on both sides of the family.
Yeah.
So.
Oh yeah, it was not well received, let me tell you. They grew to love one another and really appreciate, at least, I mean, it was really bad in my parents' case. And but ultimately, over, as soon as my brother and I were born, grandkids are the great glue that combine, you're like, oh, I gotta love my grandchild.
Oh yeah.
So I think, and they were living on the island back then, on the Vancouver Island. And so we went and visited them, and when we were about 4 or 5 years old, and my grandparents didn't forgive my father, but they accepted her and loved her to some degree more than my so, and vice versa. My grandmother and grandfather, French Canadians, were, very suspicious of my father, and then grew to love him, and appreciated his, concept of life. And, one of the reasons my mother married an English man was that she didn't want to have at that time there were 8 or 9 children was the norm. And she came from a family of 8 or 9, and she really wanted to have a small family, and she didn't want to have that whole Catholic thing. So that was one of the drawing cards of my father. I mean, and I talk about it in my seminars because, it was a very powerful thing. The religion, even back in my day, when I was a little girl, when the priest came knocking and said to my mom, "So, are you busy? What's going on?" And my mother said, she, took us out of the room, and we asked her what the priest had wanted, and he wanted to know if I was going to have any more children, and I told him, what did you tell him? And well, I told him it was none of his business. And so she was really shaken up, though, and my father was aghast, so yeah, and this is like late 60s, early 70s, so I mean, it still was going on. It broke after a while, it's not like that anymore, but as far as I know.
I don't think it's a hard and fast rule as much anymore, but I just think it's more common. Again, that's because of the social circles.
Well, and don't forget, and once those Filles du Roi arrived, the priest was knocking on their door every year. And then you will see from the time they could have children to the time when their bodies said, no way, no more. They had a child a year or 18 months, whatever it was. But they would literally have, because the priest was knocking on the door, and they were absolutely not forced, but obligated. And of course, there was no birth control or anything like that. So it's the rare family that you will find less than 5 children, for example. If you have a Filles du Roi who comes across and she's 30 or 35 years old, I have one that was 40 years old and actually had one child brought over and was able to produce another child. And I just did one. She was 47 years old and had a child. So, I mean, they literally, and remember, they were paid a bonus by the government to have, X number of children. And even in my own life, I think there was something called a baby bonus,
Still is.
something like that. Do you remember
Well,
that?
they call it child tax credit now.
Yeah, that's it. And so, and I think it started, in officially and during my lifetime, but certainly in that time in the 16th and 17th century, the priests were coming and they were literally telling them, you're not doing your duty. And that's how they ended up with 20 kids, and truly. 20. The most that I've seen is 18 recorded children of a Filles du Roi, and she was based out of Longueuil, Boucherville, in that area, and just tremendous. And I think out of those 18, I think 13 to 14 actually produced descendants. So it was extraordinary.
Yeah, I think that was Catholicism at worst.
Yeah, at its greatest, exactly.
Uh,
And but no, as we grow and as we see the French Canadian impact, many of them would take and would go to Detroit, would go to Louisiana, would go afield to Wisconsin and all of these different places. I just completed a tree of someone from who went from Saint Hyacinthe, Quebec, just outside of Drummondville, about an hour or so, and they got land in North Dakota and settled there at the turn of the century. The French Canadians that moved around really moved.
Yeah.
My French Canadians did not move around. They stayed in Trois-Rivières and Drummondville area and are still there to this day. I do not have any records of anyone moving around in my direct ancestry. So they were pretty static and farming and that sort of thing. And I actually went back in a couple of years ago and went back to the area of Trois-Rivières where they came from. It's Betska and Saint-Geneviève-de-Betz, very small little town. And we stayed there with our RV and it was truly beautiful. I could imagine why they didn't want to leave, because why would you leave? It was gorgeous, right by the St. Lawrence and that sort of thing. So it was really nice.
And you have everything you need, and yeah, why go?
You had to have an adventurous spirit, and those that did really did. And I've scores and scores of French Canadians who braved it, that wanted land, that weren't so concerned about the impact of the Catholic religion. Although, for example, some that went to Kansas, they would just build their own churches as they went on, you know, and that's the beginning of Catholicism, if you will, the French Catholics, certainly. And there are places in Kansas, Concordia, Kansas, for example, very French Canadian roots. And we have obviously in Wisconsin, I do a series on my YouTube channel called How French is America. And I take each state and try to identify those French Canadian pockets, if you will, not of people necessarily, but how the French Canadians left their imprint.
Now that was that most of that I guess French expansion, because they already started to expand before Quebec fell, or was it after that they
It was after, it was after. So it was not like, you do have the ones, I mean, the ones that are in Detroit, that's definitely before, because they were the coureurs de bois and they were the voyageurs and all of that. And Manitoba, the same thing. So this is definitely in that period of time. And but the ones that came across after, that settled in the New England towns and all of that, the traditional migration patterns that you see for French Canada, and that, you know, your listeners may have, you know, been born in Maine, but yet their parents came over, that sort of thing. And that's very traditional. But the non-traditional routes are the ones that, like I said, somebody came from Saint-Hyacinthe to, you know, this little town in North Dakota. It was on the border, granted, but we also have cases I mean, Illinois and Iowa and all of these different places where they ended up getting that free land and wanting to build something. And usually they came in groups. They didn't come alone. And so that is one of the things. And one of the things that makes it so challenging in French Canadian genealogy, when you're doing it and you're American, is that the names and the pronunciations have changed so drastically that you can't even identify it as French. So you don't really know that it's French. You know, why would you think that someone with the last name White would be Leblanc? How could you know that? Until you do the due diligence and you figure out why were they, you know, if somebody is born, for example, you have a Stephen White and you have some kind of connection. Now there are Whites in Acadia, and I grant you that, Leblancs in particular, and I don't know why I picked that, but that's an example where they would have changed their name or had it translated for them or mispronounced it. And a lot of times, you know, you're dealing with that kind, and particularly in Massachusetts, and in Connecticut and New Hampshire and all of these places, the pronunciations. Now, when you go further afield, they may have kept the spelling of it, but the pronunciation would change drastically. So in that case of the people that went to Kansas, I have an example of the last name in French was Chartier. No one could just get, you know, it could be Cartier, it could be Chartier. But when I heard it, it became Shortier. I had no idea, like they kept telling me they were French Canadian, and I was like, Shortier. And as a French Canadian, I didn't really know, like I didn't understand at that time. This is probably 15 years ago. I didn't really understand how they would have messed it up. But anyway, so when I finally saw it written, I was like, oh, Chartier. Okay. Same difference with another case that I looked at. It was Loringer. Loringer, she said, my great grandmother was a Loringer. And I was like, oh, okay. And she said she was from France. And this is a case study I do in one of my seminars. And turns out it was Loranger. And Loranger actually is a D name. A D name is the nickname that they were given. And so in this case, the actual family of her grandmother was a Rivard, Rivard, and a D name, D Loranger, was given to her great grandfather. And when they came across, obviously they didn't want to have this big old name. So I think it happened like probably in Detroit, because this family actually took the Detroit route and then settled in California, but they adopted the last name. So you may have Rival, or you may have River, Rival, or Lorangers, and they are all the same family. And Loranger is actually a derivative of the word oranger, because this fellow used to plant his crops in such a neat order that he was given the nickname Loranger, that he organizes it. So the nicknames that you get can vary many times, but it tells you something. So it may tell you the origin of the place where he's from in France, or it may tell you something about that he was, large, le gros, or it could be le petit, or it could be the reverse. He could be a very small man and be given the word le gros. It could be a joke. La Liberté is a nickname, for example. Vie la Liberté, you'll see that name. The Cercle du Soleil person, André La Liberté, that is a D name that was taken away or given to them because of the military, and they wanted freedom. And so you'll see many La Libertés, and they're not necessarily related, because they were given that nickname. And then we go to the proper name, which is in that case was Lesnie. Lesnie de la Liberté was the original immigrant. And so to get to that level, I just did a case study of a person from Idaho, Villeneuve, and no one could find his name until I realized that Villeneuve was the Dineuve. Villeneuve means new town.
Yep.
So somewhere along the line, he was given that nickname, or he took it, but his actual name was Amiot. So when I found the name and connected the dots, and that once you establish that, it's like a super highway to French Canada, because then you can find them. But if you don't know that, it's going to make it really tough. So the translation of names, the mispronunciation, and the D name make it complicated to find the root. Once you find the root, it'll be easy. Easier.
Yeah, the Scots use a lot of dit names to call them, the same sort of thing.
They do?
Yeah, because you'd have any Ronald McDonald's, believe it or not, I know that I've known in my life, but or John McLeod or Billy McLeod. So you'd have Big Billy. There's a person in my grandmother's town is known as Junior. He's was between my mother's generation, my grandmother's generation, his age.
Yes.
He was known as Junior. Nobody can remember what his father's name is.
Okay. Because
even here in Acadia too, you go up Western PI and you'll have like Jimmy Fix It.
no.
Yeah, everybody, that's what they'll know him as. He does have a last name, but that's, if you talk to people, you'd say, "Oh, Jimmy Fix It," or something similar to that way.
Oh, isn't that something?
Yeah.
Well, I tell you, PEI is going to be my first stop when we're currently in the process of, reevaluating where we're going and that sort of thing. But definitely the Maritimes are probably the first place I'm going. On my way to Quebec, of course, which is always my home place. But I've got to visit my brother in Fredericton. So obviously, I'll do the PEI thing, and then I'll do Nova Scotia and do all that. So you and I are definitely going to meet up at some point in person. But no, that's fascinating.
Oh yeah, I mean, it just really is a good, especially when you have people with common names. Like I said, you have Ronald McDonald, so you might have Ronald the Baker. They just so.
Oh yeah, le boucher. Yeah, the baker, boulanger. And my last name on my grandmother's side is Lefebvre de Boulanger, the baker.
Yeah.
And eventually they took Boulanger and they left Lefebvre. And then obviously when you go back, you'll find the Lefebvre the original name. But it's just fascinating to see. And I didn't realize that the Scots did that as well.
The Scots do that as well. It's very.
I only know one in the French land, which is, and I'm always fascinated, and I haven't done any due diligence on this, but obviously the Plains of Abraham, Abraham l'Écossais, which is the Scotsman, Abraham Martin. So I'm thinking was he Scottish?
He was Scottish.
He must have been. Why would they have given him that nickname?
The Scot, like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he happened to be there. Now, was he Catholic? I don't think so. Did he become Catholic? Were there Scottish?
There's a large portion of.
Really? Okay.
That the whole war in Scotland fought over that.
I mean,
twice.
Oh, there you go. So I've got to learn about that.
At least,
And so he did marry a French Canadian lady, and you know his all of his children were just knee deep in the colony of Quebec, of New France, and all of that. And at the very beginning, of course, he grew the fame of his land being used at the 1759 battle, but he was pivotal. He's on that monument in Quebec with all the founding families and all that, and he was there at
yeah, I
the very
think
beginning.
if I'm correct, he was from Scotland, then he was in in the Normandy area, I think, and then he came to Quebec.
Is that right?
I
Okay.
believe he had been in France for
For a brief
for a while.
time, probably picked up a wife and
Yeah,
I
it's
think he was, I mean, I think he was born like, I want to say like 1587. He was not a young man when he was in Quebec. Um, and I think he was a ship's captain. I think did you remember that or is that
I can't
no,
remember, but I do
no.
remember that he had been in France for.
Thank you for that bit of information. You know what? I didn't realize, I always wondered about Le Cossais and I wondered if it was a joke or I didn't know. And I never dealt, you know how you don't
Yep.
scratch this, and I didn't scratch it. And now I'm like going to scratch it because I really want to know. He's not one of my great grandfathers, but definitely I want to know more
So,
if we can.
oh, and there is actually a fair amount about him out
Okay, check
there.
that out.
So the we talked about the cities, a little bit the farmers and stuff. We talked about the women that were coming for them, but there was
Yeah,
also the group of, if you really want to call them pioneers, the voyageurs, the traders, that you know um, that for whatever reason that was the lifestyle they wanted to take. Um, so what's their impact on um, the French and the spread of the French culture in North America? And
huge. I mean, there's no other way to look at it. I'm currently researching the Métis or the Métis, I should say, as we speak, and I'm blown away by the impact of how much they established, certainly Western Canada, and how much they kind of they intermarried and created these different things. Of course, there were British men who came and all of that, and did the exploration, but the hardcore work was done by the voyageurs and also the coureurs de bois who were part of that. When you look at Detroit and you look at the Cadillac and all of his people that came and settled Detroit, you'll see on the plaque how many French Canadian names are there. And that is actually a lot of my peeps are there. My great grandparents, the Gervais and all of that, they helped in that. And then they returned to Quebec. And then some of their people actually went and continue the lines. There's a fabulous set of books, and I don't have the information, but it's on the famille Allard, Allard, and it's written by a man, I believe, who's from Michigan. It's a 7 series of books, and it takes you from the Filles du Roi, from the first Allard, who married a Fille du Roi, and it goes all the way down into 7 generations deep of the Detroit experience. So it's a fascinating read, really good writer. And I was mesmerized. It's been a few years since I read the series, but just amazing, amazing book. And you really learn a lot about how they came across and what they did. And I would hardly recommend to any of you who have that kind of Michigan or that kind of people that would have traveled. The other type of people who were not necessarily, the voyageurs, because the voyageurs were very early on. They were like truly 16th and 17th centuries. And later on, it was really about finding your place in the sun, basically, or not liking. A lot of times, as when the British took over the French, there was a movement to leave, leave and be able to practice your religion privately or do whatever. And obviously, America had that freedom at that time to be able to practice. This is after the American Revolution and everything. So that was part of the drawing card. And yes, you had to speak English, but if you moved to like a place like Nebraska, you could build your own country almost, which many of them did. and their own little world. And that's what they did in Wisconsin. That's what now in Wisconsin is very early on, and you'll see several Filles du Roi actually married those particular voyageurs, and they were part of that expedition. But later on, it would be people who just simply wanted to explore new worlds. And certainly once you get out of Quebec, and many of them went to Ontario, for example, many of them went to Ontario and then made their way south. So they had this trajectory. Again did a tree on that, where the person, had spent a few years, like a decade almost, in Ontario, and then he married a French Canadian who was not Catholic, and she was Protestant. So that was interesting. So I have the connection there. And then they went down to and I don't know if they ended up, I think they ended up practicing. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back on my notes, but that was part of why I couldn't find the marriage record, because they didn't get married in the Catholic Church, because they couldn't have. Okay, they were probably married by a preacher or something like that, and or justice of the peace in Ontario. And I don't have the records for that, but that is how I found her and found the connection. But again, the urge to move and the urge to acquire is knee deep in, we have this impression of the French Canadians, just many people do, as being bon vivant. And they are, trust me, they love to eat and party, and they love life and all of that. They're truly, in many respects, they're very much like the Cape Bretoners, I think. They have got that spirit of fun, I think. I mean, that's how I view Cape Breton. I don't know why, but when I was there many years ago, that's the feeling I had. I had a feeling that I was home, actually. But other than that, they wanted to control their own destiny. They're very, very stubborn people, and they don't like to be told what to do. That's the bottom line. You talk to any French Canadian, they don't like being told what to do. And that comes from generations of being told what to do. And so now they definitely wanted to be able to control their own destiny.
So, with that, I know that when I talk about Canadians that have family in the United States, often there was I know it's true for my family and others, that post-World War II movement did you see that in the French communities as much moving south as
I don't really see it as much, but I think that pre in the 20s and 30s and 40s, that's when they made their mark. And so they would settle there. And then, of course, once they settled in places in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, then the movement it becomes less obvious. It becomes less obvious in terms of them moving, because they'll just come and live with their parent, and then with their brother or their uncle or whatever, and they would move across. I haven't studied, for example, I studied greatly the 1930s and 1920s, because that was a very industrial, spot. I haven't studied, and of course, the 1950 census just came out, but and the thing is that they are definitely because of the quiet revolution that occurred in Quebec in the 1960s. French Canadians have kind of reclaimed themselves and don't have that urge to go to America anymore as much. They tend not to want to. They travel, of course, but they tend to be much more focused on staying. Remember that the French Canadians moved, particularly on the East Coast, for job opportunities, because they couldn't exist in the farming communities anymore, and they needed money. So they would then work in the factories. Well, when the factories became open in Canada, for example, in my little town of Drummondville, the Celanese grew up in 1926, and it was built and employed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And my father, as an Englishman, was one of the superintendents. My French side of my family were part of the workers. And so that is part of the dynamic that we now eventually, with the Quiet Revolution, the French eventually became supervisors. And so they had much more opportunities to do their thing, if you will, in their own and their home and native land. And they didn't have to go looking for money. They could actually work because of the fact that the Quebec became much more industrialized. And then eventually they would work in factories, and then eventually they could turn. Now, why would they go to a place where their language would be prohibitive for them?
Yeah.
So that was part of it. And then, gradually, in my lifetime, I knew very few people who were French Canadians who went and traveled across and lived. But as a genealogist, I have no, and as a person who talks to people, I'll talk to one of my best friends in Drummondville, and I'll say, he goes, oh yeah, my grandmother was born in Massachusetts in 1928 or something. And another best friend will say, oh no, my grandfather went here and he worked for a time. So I think it was a past generation that did that. I don't think, and I could be wrong, I don't think they're doing it as much now.
No, even with what's going on between Canada and U.S. relations, it's funny. It's the Quebec sovereignty is not an issue anymore because
No, anytime you can get Quebecers to be proud and fly the Canadian flag, you're good to go. I mean, this is phenomenal. I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. And it's one of the reasons why, I'm actually in the process of I'm a dual citizen. So I'm in the process of possibly moving back for a time. For like not during the winter. I don't, I'm not that sacrificial, but definitely during the summer, I would want to live in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely look at them and my ancestors. I look at in places like Jamaica, there was a large Scottish plantation. But like
Yes.
people, like, why did my ancestors choose Cape Breton?
Oh, wow. It's rough.
I guess they didn't know any better.
Well, they maybe came in the summer and then, oh, wow, okay, it gets bad. So yeah, no, I mean, I mean, it's not that I wouldn't live in Canada during the winter or in a rough spot in New England. It's just that I've been in the Southwest now for 25 years. So my blood's really thin.
Yeah.
So when it gets to it, like right now, yesterday it was 96 degrees here in Tucson. And I mean, that's a bit too hot for this early in the year, but it's usually in the 80s in March and April. And then, of course, we have the horrible times during the summer of 115 or so.
Which is when you'd want to be.
Yes, that's exactly why I want to go. So
back
I
in
remember when
Canada.
I was traveling to Quebec, and this fellow, I was doing the Chemin du Roi, which is another thing that your listeners may be interested in. It's the Route 138, which is along the St. Lawrence River, and all of those little towns, we call them the Chemin du Roi, the King's Road, and it was built about 1740s or so, 1738, and I really wanted to explore. So that's what we did. We actually took across country, we traveled, and then we did the whole thing, and I stayed in Neuville, and and we were gonna not hook up, and it got so hot. I said, I called the guy. I go, do you have a spot for our RV? And he goes, oui, c'est beau, it's nice, but you cannot use your air conditioner after 11 o'clock. Now, telling that to someone who's lived in Tucson for a long time, I'm like, what? You won't need it. I promise. I promise you, you will not need it. Like, okay, honey, we're going to go here. Okay. So we went, and sure enough, we were right on the banks of the St. Lawrence River, and we did not need air conditioning. So it was amazing. So yes, I want to return there very shortly. Is it like that in PEI? Like if you're like right on this, like what's the coast like?
It's nice. I I go down to Florida when I've been down there, or when I've been to Cuba. It's warm for me, so I'm wearing shorts. And I know when we were in Florida, people were looking at us like, "What are you doing?" Like,
My brother, who's in New Brunswick, is in Hawaii right now.
yeah,
He spends about 5 months a year in Hawaii, so
yeah.
he can't do it.
That's definitely a way to do it if you can.
And then when you think of our ancestors and what they lived through, we're wimps.
Oh, we're
We're
wimps. Yeah, like even the thoughts of like when you think about that these people come to a
But
new
they
place that they didn't
survived.
know to survive.
Oh,
you read the first years when they were there, when they, you know, are huddled in these little very primitive shacks that they made because they came in the fall and they couldn't build a proper house, so they
I can't wait to interview you and hear all about your stories, and because we're doing this back and forth. I cannot wait. I'm going to be like, and then what happened? So that's going to be my thing. But I do want to offer to any of your listeners, I would like to offer just kind of a giveaway, if you will. And
yeah.
if anyone is interested in having me look at their tree, absolutely free. I would be, if you want to, I don't know, pick a name at
Yeah.
random or whatever, please do. And I'd be delighted to help someone find their roots. Okay. So absolutely send that out to, or put that
Oh,
in your chat or whatever when
perfect.
you broadcast it. I'd be happy to do that.
Well, if a person's wanting, they think they have French roots and they're wanting to look, where do they start?
Well, I would tend to believe if they have French, well, first of all, you start with yourself, you
Yeah.
go, you do the due diligence, and I guess it depends on why they think they have French roots.
Like they're just the family story, their great grandmother's from Quebec. So
Yeah.
where would they start? But they don't know really where to start looking or what
Well,
records.
they would have to, like in the birth certificate of the preceding generation, find the name. And
Mhm.
then from that name, then they would have, depending on the year that we're talking about, again, it's much easier if we're pre-19, I would say like in the 1920s or 30s, because it's much more open. In Canada, we only have the 1931 census, whereas in the US, because of not as strong privacy
Yeah.
laws, it's 1950. So much easier to research. So it depends a little bit on that. But one of the best sites you could ever go on is Genealogy Quebec. And that is the place because they actually have the marriage certificates from 1926, I think it's 1926 to 1994, about or 1997. So if, for example, your peeps or your grandparents got married in Quebec during that time, you literally have to just type their name in, and out will come a marriage record, and you'll see it. And then hopefully, with any luck at all, then you can, once you have that, you find them on a census and you go on. And again, each case is so unique
Yeah.
that, but the Genealogy Quebec, obviously Ancestry is a wonderful place. Again, the only caveat I say is that it's fun to click. When I first started, I went all the way to Charlemagne and then had to undo everything. So when I was, just starting out, but ultimately you want to not use other people's trees. You use them as clues, and then it doesn't matter if it's French Canadian or regular genealogy. But once you're into French Canada, and you're, if you speak French, great. If most people do not speak French, and one of the keys is to be able to understand the marriage record, because the marriage record in Quebec is like nothing else. And it is the starting point. It isn't finding the baptismal of what you think is your grandmother is not actually the right thing. What you should be doing is verifying her parents.
Yeah.
And so if you know, for example, that maybe you don't know her parents, but on her baptismal, it will say so and so. It will tell the maiden name and the father's name, so that's good. But then go back and find the marriage, and then once you find the marriage of those two people, then you connect them to that daughter, and you try to find her on the census report, and then that makes the whole picture. A lot of times I won't even look for the baptismal. I'm going to look for the actual marriage record. So if your grandmother, for example, was married in Quebec, then I'm going to find the marriage. I want to find the marriage because I'm going to find the father, the grandfather, maybe, unless you got married in a different place, and then that's a whole other thing. But once you establish, and on that marriage record, here's what you're going to find, and this is why it makes it so critical. You're going to find her maiden name, her parents, her father's name, obviously, and her mother's maiden name. You're going to find out if their parents are alive or dead. And then you're going to find out her father and her father's name, and her mother, the father's mother's maiden name, and if they're alive or dead. That is an incredible, incredible genealogy. So once you establish that, it becomes easier because you know how many Jean Baptiste there are of a given name? You can easily confuse them. And I actually, after all these years, found a mistake in my, not that my tree is without mistakes, but it was a glaring omission. And I was like, what? I had put the wrong parents to this particular person because I didn't read the marriage certificate. So understanding, and once you know how to read it, it becomes very, very very easy, even if you don't speak French. So that's the key. The key is to be able to find, to get them to Quebec. Like in some of my case studies, it takes generations to get them to Quebec. Once we get them to Quebec, the baptismal and marriage and death records are usually so good that it's an easy thing. Now, the Quebec Genealogy is a paid site. The free site is a free site that I use a lot called Nos Origines.
Okay.
And you type that in, and it's kind of like I want to say it's kind of like a wiki tree for French.
Okay.
Not quite as good, but it definitely does the job. I mean, there's missing people and that sort of thing. And certainly if your people are in America, they're not gonna, they don't continue. They're really concerned about and obviously WikiTree is an amazing resource that more people, I hope, use. And I'm actually in the process of putting in a lot of French Canadian names that are my, my uncles and that sort of thing, just to be able to help people find their peeps because it really is hard. And so I'm kind of doing that whenever I have a minute. And those are the three sites that I use the most: Genealogy Quebec, Nos Origines, and I think there's an English version of it too. No, Our Origins. I'm not sure. And then of course WikiTree. Those are the three I use consistently. And there's many. There's a website called the French Canadian Genealogist that I love. There's just so many.
Is there specific records? I know that when I'm looking in the English world, when I'm looking for different records, there's certain things that I'm not going to find it because the government at the time had no concern about that, but I'll find it in church records, or I can find school records, which tell a lot.
Yeah.
Is there any, is there a key point when, if you're looking for anything before this year, you should be looking at
I know what you're saying. Okay. Yes. If the Drouin collection and all of that is found in the Quebec genealogy, the Genealogie Quebec. And that's one of the things. You also have the Programme de Démographique PDRH that you can use as well. It's again, pay as you go site. The WikiTree and the Nos Origines are completely free, and that's a good place to start. But anything prior to, I would have to say, like in the baptismal, it would be prior to 1940 on the Drouin, and the marriage are, again, that's kind of where it stopped. That's why the Genealogy Quebec is so amazing. When I found that, it blew my mind because literally I could research. I found my own grandparents' marriage record that was not. And when I say record, I don't mean it's not like the marriage record that you're familiar with, from the church. It's an actual marriage record that is amazing. And it really lists, just like you would think, the name, the birth dates, all of that. It's not as complete as the marriage records, again, but at least it brings you forward to 1980 or 1960. And many of us, and as time goes on, more and more people are looking, and they're looking for 1960. Well, there isn't anything.
Yeah.
The only place you're going to find it really is on Genealogie Quebec in terms of and they have a death record as well, which is amazing. It doesn't give you the whole complete thing, but it does give you enough information. It sometimes gives you the maiden name and that sort of thing. So I would absolutely recommend using that for marriage and death to be able to bring you back to the place where the records are there. Now, are there some records that you're never going to be able to find? Absolutely. In the 1600s, a lot of times sometimes I can't find a marriage record of these people. I have to assume they were married because there was no church And I'm just currently working on a seminar for the Carignan-Salient regiment soldiers. And so I'm talking about St. Ours. St. Ours did not have a church until, whenever. And so the people that would get married in 1671, there's no record. So I don't know. I don't think they burnt down. I think they went to Sorel, maybe a traveling minister, and he said, okay, here you go. There's no record. And so some people, literally, when I do a biography of them, they don't have they don't have a baptismal, they don't have a marriage, and they don't have a death even. And the only way I can prove who they are is usually by the census reports and some antidote, and maybe the ship's record. We know that they came, because each of those Filles du Roi came on a ship and it's numbered and it has a date. So we know how they came across. The Carignan-Salient soldiers, we know when they landed.
And
So
those records are intact.
Yes, they are intact. So there's ways. Most people you can find, there are some sites out there, as you get deeper and deeper, please feel free. Any of your readers, please feel free to reach out if you're looking for something. Sometimes it'll take me 2 minutes and go, okay, no, look there.
Yeah.
So it's like anything else. I'm sure if I asked you for where's something in, PI, you'd be like, oh, okay, no, you have to look there.
On those sites, they generally indexed, or do you get to see the actual record?
On that site that I'm talking about with the marriage record, it's the actual record. And for the death record, it is an index with the so I'm not saying the death, how you would have, but at least I have a date, so I can write to Quebec and say, can I have, I'm the descendant, can I have the that's how I actually found the actual date of my great grandfather's death. So I mean, you know how it is, you want to order a death certificate and you don't even have a date.
Yeah.
So I did not have a date. This was in 1955, and I was able to order the information. So all of that helps the cause, you know what I mean? And on that site they have obituaries, they have all kinds of things. It's just an amazing site. I should do commercials for them. They're just amazing.
Now, for an Anglophone, who's maybe their French is their great grandmother and passed out. Are these sites easy to navigate? Obviously the language.
Yes, they're all
it's like anything. You learn a few keywords, you learn what you're looking for.
Yeah, no, and the Genealogy Quebec is there's I don't use it, but there's a button that says once upon a time I accidentally clicked the English and I was like, oh, I didn't know, because I don't even think I think in French, so I don't. And so I was like, oh, there's a translation, but I prefer, because I speak it, I prefer to read it in the actual language. But absolutely, you can have at least the press here, go there kind of thing. Otherwise, it can be a bunch of gobbledygook,
Definitely. Great. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you today. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if there's anything else I missed that
I'm sure there'll be questions. We can maybe do a follow-up, or maybe on our, maybe we can do that.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you ever so much for the opportunity.
You're welcome.
Take care.
That brings us to the end of another episode of the How We Got Here podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Brian loves hearing from you, so please feel free to leave a comment below. If you have a burning genealogy question or a fantastic idea for a future episode, send an email to podcast@howwegothere.ca. And don't forget to check out the show notes for links and more details about Lisa at Have Roots Will Travel, and some of the sites she mentioned for searching for your French ancestry in North America. If you would like to win the free consultation on your French ancestry from Lisa, there will be a link where you can enter the draw.